Broadcasting live from the School of Athens, this is Europe and the People Without History with Mr. Olson, everyone's favorite AP World History Review service. So today we are going to take a crack at the beginning of Period 5 in Absolutism, Enlightenment, and that's right, America. Now, Period 5 is denoted by this history teacher's favorite historian, Eric Hobsbawm, as the long 19th century. It refers to the dates between 1750 and 1900, where there is a preeminence of political and economic revolution mixed in with some imperialism. Now, the period begins in 1750 with the onset of the Industrial Revolution and ends in 1900, right as the world is on the cusp of a massive world war. Now, Eric Hobsbawm defined this period as one being characterized by a dual revolution, meaning that there were two revolutions that were driving much of the developments throughout the world. One being the French Revolution that happens at the end of the 1700s and the beginning of the 1800s, and the Industrial Revolution, which begins in 1750 and goes on and on and on. To understand this period, we need to begin with new ideological developments in Europe, and that will then permeate throughout the world. But in order to do that, we need to contextualize. So before we get to the Enlightenment, which will be the basis of today's conversation for the most part, let's talk about where it came from. And before we talk about the Enlightenment, we need to contextualize it with what happened first. Now, prior to the Enlightenment, there had been for about 300 years in Europe developing a political system known as the divine right of kings. And the divine right of kings basically posited that kings get their power from God and therefore they cannot be challenged. This is best exemplified and illustrated in a speech that was delivered by King of England, King James I, or fifth, depending on how you count him, on March 21st, 1609. Now, he gives this speech to Parliament, and he says that the state of monarchy is the supremest thing upon earth, meaning that kings are the most important political beings, and that monarchy is the most important political system on earth. Now, he's saying it to Parliament, which is really a slap in the face. He continues by saying that, and the like power have kings, they make and unmake their subjects and are accountable to none but God only, which means that nobody on earth can question a king unless they're God. And actually, if you go so far as to question a king, it is blasphemy, because the king is essentially God on earth, handpicked by God to rule over the people with omnipotence. Now, several philosophers and thinkers came along, and they famously, or infamously, however you want to say it, said things like, if you want to know who controls you, look at who you are not allowed to criticize. Now, Voltaire, one of our famous Enlightenment philosophers, is responding directly to comments like that in the Divine Right of Kings speech. You can't criticize the king? Well, then the king controls you. Baron de Montesquieu said it is necessary from the very nature of things that power should be a check to power, meaning one person should not have all the power. You should split that up to make it a little bit more democratic. And then John Locke, who I would say is an imbecile, but he had some quotes. All mankind being all equal and independent, no one ought to harm another in his life, health, liberty, or possessions. Funny, because John Locke definitely didn't care if the Native Americans had their land taken away. Anyways, we're going to go ahead and jump right in by talking about absolutism first, and then we'll get to America, I promise. So absolute monarchs are those like James I, that we read his speech before, who thought that they got their power from God. Other absolute monarchs came up from Europe from time to time, and there is a long-running list. You might have already talked about Isabella and Ferdinand, who quickly develop into monarchs that oversee a modern nation-state when they recaptured Spain from the Moors and the Reconquista. Now, other absolute monarchs that you might have heard of or might hear about in a second: Philip II of Spain, Queen Elizabeth of England, not the current one, but the one from a long time ago, Charles I of England, or King Louis XIV of France. Now, if you want to pause me and look up some of these absolute monarchs, go for it. When you do so, you should look for who preceded them, how long they ruled, positive things they did, awful things they did, and who succeeded them. So let's take an example. Let's look at King Louis the 14th, okay? He's dubbed the Sun King, which is, of course, why I'm called the Sun Teacher. Ha! Okay, so King Louis XIV is on record the longest reigning monarch in world history. He ruled for 72 years. He also built Versailles, this immaculate and ostentatious palace, which is, of course, a ridiculous waste of money considering that most of his people couldn't even eat at times. It has a hall of mirrors, and it has a stupid amount of fountains, and it has ridiculous statues. It cost an estimated $2.5 billion in 2003 money, which means it's even more today. 36,000 laborers were forced to build that thing. Anyways, that's part of his legacy. Now, he oversaw many military conflicts and persecuted Protestants to benefit his Catholic friends. He also centralized power. So you can see that absolute monarchs, they have some capacity to do good things, but they also have capacity to do questionable ones. Like we said, King Louis had a really, really close relationship with the Catholic Church, and as a result of that, the Catholic Church was able to thrive under the Sun King, but it required a lot of taxes, both to keep the Catholic Church going and to build stupid palaces like Versailles. As a result of this, King Louis XIV, he kind of gained a reputation. He was definitely the quintessential absolute monarch. Now, in France, France is not the place where things blow up first. It actually happens in England, where literally somebody tries to blow up a king, naughty, naughty Guy Fawkes, and we get a battle between Parliament and the king. That's why James I had to give that speech saying that kings are the most divine thing on earth. Now, the battle between Parliament and king picks up a little bit, and it actually leads to a civil war between the king's forces and Puritan Roundheads led by a guy named Oliver Cromwell. Now, eventually what happens is the king gets his head chopped off, and Oliver Cromwell puts it on display for everyone to see. That is nuts. Now, let's pause and talk about another aspect of absolute monarchies. They are all in the family. So the guy who gave that speech at the beginning, James I, here he is. He was the first king in the House of Stuart. Now you will see that his son, Charles I, is the one who gets his head chopped off. Now for a short period between Charles I and Charles II, there's a period known as the...
Good morning, Mustangs. The Blue Hawk Coffee Cart is now open outside of the library. Stop by for coffee, tea, and cappuccinos. Have a great Friday.
Apologies for the tyranny of kid capitalism there. Okay, so James I spawns Charles I. Charles I gets his head chopped off, and then there's a period in between kings that is led by Oliver Cromwell, where he's called Lord Protector. Now, as Lord Protector, Oliver Cromwell didn't really do that great of a job and persecuted him some Irish people, and as a result, after he dies, they call the monarchs back, and that's why we have a little lull between 1649 and 1660. Now, eventually, they learn to rule with a little bit more benevolence, but that still doesn't stop the English from wanting more rights, and they pass in 1688 a Bill of Rights that has with it a social contract, meaning that the people are able to negotiate with the king and parliament rights that they get. Now, the ball is moving, we're on to something. Now, perhaps you've already discussed the Renaissance, the Protestant Reformation, and the Scientific Revolution in class. The final stop in this trajectory is the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment is a period that it features a lot of well-known and prolific philosophers and thinkers that basically remake the way the world is thought. If I were to define the Enlightenment, I would say it's an intellectual movement that sought to challenge the political and religious status quo by using logic and reason. So some names you might recognize are Hobbes, Locke, Montesquieu, and they established many books and they wrote down many things, and Diderot put together this library known as the Encyclopedia, and it was a bunch of books that people read on the topic. It's kind of like what Muslim scholars were doing in the House of Wisdom a long time ago. But anyways, it spawns a new age of ideas that is, at its heart, a challenge to authority. Now, this new way of thinking about things is going to spawn new ideas in its own right, and as a result, you get several isms. Maybe these are isms that you have heard of, but they're all the consequences of the Enlightenment. So socialism, which some would argue is very good, is a result of the Enlightenment, and social Darwinism, as most people would argue, is very, very bad, also the result of the Enlightenment. So can you have too much reason? Well, I would argue that yes, because reason applies to different people in different ways. So there's this book called Voltaire's Bastards. It's, of course, a critique of the Enlightenment, in which John Ralston Saul shows that throughout the West there is a crisis due largely to our blind faith in reason. We've taken the Enlightenment too far. Instead of a basis for ethical behavior, reason is often deduced to mere practicality. So we just do things not because they're good or benevolent. We do them because they are reasonable or logical. If we continue to allow the process-minded experts, or Voltaire's bastards, to run society, we risk the breakdown of our legal, financial, and cultural systems and endangering our society. So can too much enlightenment be a thing? This guy and your teacher would say definitely. Now, these new ideas have their roots in ideas like the social contract that we mentioned before. This is an idea that we can attribute back to Hobbes, who saw the English Civil War and how horrible it was, and said basically, like, people need to have a say in all these things. Later comes John Locke, who says that people are born a blank slate or a tabula rasa, and as a result of that, they should be free to make themselves into whatever they can, unless, of course, you're a Native American or someone from Africa. Okay, now, philosophers come on the heels of those people, like Benjamin Franklin, Mary Wollstonecraft, Voltaire, who we saw earlier, Rousseau, who we'll see a little bit more in a second, and they sort of build on these Enlightenment ideas. The best example of this is Mary Wollstonecraft, who applies a feminist or gender lens to the Enlightenment. So she says things like, only that education deserves emphatically to be termed with cultivation of the mind, which teaches young people to begin to think. So she's saying we need to educate people to think. She also says, I do not wish for women to have power over men, but over themselves. That's indicating that they didn't have power over themselves before, so you need to bring an educated lens to the Enlightenment, but also one that brings fairness and equality to women. Okay, so now pause me and go ahead and take a shot of this one. This has your main Enlightenment philosophers who task themselves with challenging absolute monarchies or the status quo. Now, it wasn't just philosophers and thinkers that decided to adopt Enlightenment ideas. It was also some kings and queens like Frederick of Prussia, Napoleon, Catherine the Great of Russia were known as enlightened despots. They took Enlightenment philosophies and applied them to the way that they ruled over their people. But that begs the question, is being an enlightened despot okay if you're still a despot? One would argue that if you're a king or a queen, then you're taking most of the power for yourself. So even if you're enlightened, that doesn't necessarily mean that you're good. Let's give an example of that. So as Enlightenment ideas are starting to percolate throughout Europe, you still have a economic system in which kings and queens and their lackeys get to oversee most of the world's economic functions. This is, of course, mercantilism, the idea that the mother country controls all economic decisions and that those decisions are predicated upon making a profit. Now, you need colonies, which requires a subjugation of people already living there, and you need labor, the subjugation of people who were before free, in order to have this mercantile system. Now, if the world is going to be one in which European powers are racing to accumulate as much wealth as possible, you're going to get a world that looks like this, where colonies are trickled throughout the globe. And of course, whenever you see European powers this close on a continent, even Europe, you're bound to get a war. Now, the fighting starts actually in the 1500s when Spain is powerful, they're ruling the oceans, and England is on the up and up, and they fight a major battle in the Spanish Armada where the wind and the English kick the crap out of the Spanish boats, sink a bunch of them, and sink Spain's chances to be the global hegemon anymore. So after 1588, you actually get a changing of the guard, and England will be the most powerful country in the world. So if you look at this map then, here's England in red, and you can see that they have substantial land claims in North America, really close to France, which of course is going to lead to war between the two. So here's where our Enlightenment has gotten us. It's gotten us a system by which absolute monarchs are being challenged, but the absolute monarchs are now trying to go out and make a better existence for the people that they live with. They try to accumulate a stupid amount of goods, and they run into one another. And you get this, a 7 years war between 1754 and 1763. Wait, that's 9. That's because the first 2 years are fought only in North America. So really, the war is a 9 years war. But anyways, we'll call it a 7 years war. You can see that the Mughal Empire is involved on one side. And over here, you have people from Portugal, you have people from Prussia, you have the Iroquois Confederacy. This is a world war, people. This is a world war. You won't find it the First World War, though, because we reserve that for like 1900 stuff. Now here's what the North American continent looked like before the war. You can see that France had the middle of it, England had the eastern coast, and Spain had the stuff in the southwest. And after the war, you'll notice France is gone. All except for Haiti, which of course is important because Haiti's got a lot of money. Okay, so this war, the 7 Years' War, ended in 1763 with the Treaty of Paris. Now, side note, if you ever want to know what ended a war, always pick Treaty of Paris. See? Okay, so this Treaty of Paris resulted in France losing most of its territory in the Americas. Britain gains most of that territory, and the Native Americans are left with the British, which really sucks for them because the British just want to steal all their land. Now, there are magnificent and huge consequences of this, one of them being the American Revolution. So you might recall from your 7th grade history class that the Enlightenment had made its way over the pond to North America. That's why people like Benjamin Franklin are Enlightenment thinkers. Now, as a result of this, they start thinking, how come the king has all this power over us? And after the 7 Years' War, when England has to start raising revenue to help pay for the war and to help pay for troops on the North American continent to make sure that those colonists behave themselves, they start issuing a series of laws. The Proclamation in 1763, a line that says the colonists can't go past the Appalachian Mountains, the Stamp Act, which incurs cries of no taxation without representation, the Boston Massacre, the Boston Tea Party, and then this all culminates in Thomas Paine writing Common Sense in 1776, where he says, it doesn't make any sense for a little island to rule over a big continent. Now all the wheels are in motion for Thomas Jefferson to write the Declaration of Independence in 1776, where he says that all men are created equal. I got that idea from John Locke, who said that life, liberty, and the pursuit of property are men's natural rights. Of course, Thomas Jefferson changes it to say life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, also something said in the Declaration of Independence. Now, of course, England's response is no, which is English for no, and they respond by trying to fight the colonists. So the fighting begins at Lexington and Concord, and long story short, the colonists win, and eventually at the Battle of Yorktown beat the British and sign a treaty to end the war. Guess the name of the treaty? The Treaty of Paris. Yes, that's right. I told you any treaty that ends a war, you should always go with Treaty of Paris. Okay, anyways, this one allows the United States to become a sovereign nation, and they get all the land east of the Mississippi River. Okay, so the United States is now a country. That's great. What do? Well, they need to figure out how to create a government. Now, the first government they create doesn't work because America is imperfect. Don't tell anybody I said that, but it is. And then they come up with a better government in 1789, the one that you've grown to love and live under today. And look, they have Montesquieu and Rousseau and Voltaire influencing them, meaning that the Enlightenment is the beginning of challenging despotism and the beginning of the American government. Now, of course, the Constitution says things like we the people in order to form a more perfect union. Yeah, that union is not perfect. I hate to break it to you, but I'll leave that for you, U.S. history. Last question I have for you. How revolutionary was the American Revolution? Very? Not very? What do you think? Well, if I were to look at a picture of those people that ruled over the American colonies prior to the war, I might see a picture that looked like that, which is actually also a picture from the Constitutional Convention. So the dudes who were in power beforehand were most definitely the dudes pulling the strings and in power afterwards. See? There's Benjamin Franklin. Anyways, that's how you reach nirvana. This is your Buddha. Signing off.